Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Alissa Skog from the California Policy Lab. Welcome to our show.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about automatic conviction relief. So you guys had a report a couple weeks ago said that 2.5 million Californians are eligible to have their convictions automatically relieved. So can you tell us kind of how this automatic relief thing works? Because we've had like kind of a cumbersome process of trying to get records expunged, even old misdemeanors, you have to actually petition the court. So this is kind of a nice step up, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And just a little bit of motivation, the consequences of a criminal record can have lasting impact on a person's life. It affects people who are, arrested, never charged. This idea that long after people have quote unquote paid their debt to society, it's still affecting their life in many aspects. And as you said, there's been petition-based processes for a while, and there's been a lot of research that's shown take-up rates have been really low. So as you said, they're cumbersome, people aren't aware, maybe they're a little bit afraid. And, there's been a national movement to kind of expand relief, but automate it. So this idea that the burden shouldn't be on the person. And California is actually, I think, now has the most expansive automatic record relief policies in the country. And, one of the Department of Justice has published, the total number of records that were relieved, which was over 12 million, which is really just an amazing amount of records cleared in a really, really short time. And I think this idea of automating is really powerful, particularly when you see, 6-7% take-up rates. And really, as you said, millions of Californians no longer have a record as a result of this.
So what is the eligibility requirement? How does this thing work?
Sure. So in California, we call them non-conviction, so arrests that don't result in a conviction are eligible, but there's different waiting periods, right? So you want to make sure that it's not a case is being processed. So after a year, all misdemeanors are automatically relieved. 3 years for most felonies, and then for more serious felonies, there's a 6-year waiting period. So basically anyone where they only have an arrest record, those can be relieved after specified waiting periods. Most misdemeanor convictions are eligible. The exception is misdemeanors that require registration under California's sex offender registry, but there's different waiting periods based on the sentence type for those. And then I think what sets California apart is many felony convictions, non-serious, non-violent felony convictions are eligible as well. Again, after specified waiting periods, which can be after your probation ends or up to kind of 4 years for different sentence types. And then California has also expanded petition-based relief. So for people that have a misdemeanor offense that requires registration under California sex offender laws, a serious felony or violent felony, they can go to the court where they were sentenced and petition for relief. So similar to the old process, again, that's at the discretion of the courts. And the only kind of records that are never eligible are felonies that require registration.
So what about things like domestic violence, which I know we hear the word violence, but often domestic violence charges are misdemeanors. Are those eligible?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I understand the law is that so any misdemeanor that does not require registration, so if there's an assault that's a domestic violence related assault, I guess that is correct. Those would be eligible after specified waiting periods. And again, it's important, it's after people kind of remain crime free as well. That's a big part of this. It's not this kind of just consistently clearing old records, but it's really about that kind of debt being paid to society. Felony domestic violence offenses are often going to be considered serious and violent for the California Penal Code, so those will be at the discretion of the judges in the different counties where people were convicted.
So this is an automatic process. So how does the automatic process get triggered?
So it's done by Department of Justice. So they have kind of all the statewide, they're called rap sheets, records of arrest and prosecution. Per the legislation, they review them on kind of on an ongoing monthly basis. And as records become eligible, they are quote unquote clearing them at the state level. And then on an annual basis, they publish the number of records that have gotten relief. Now, I think, and maybe this is related to part of your earlier question, I think it's important just to understand kind of what relief means. The record doesn't totally disappear. So for example, if I have a shoplifting offense, for example, and I get it automatically relieved, there will be a note on the record that states, record was relieved under the relevant penal code. So if I go get a live scan for, a job, my current job, perhaps as a California Policy Lab researcher, that conviction should not show up on that live scan. However, if I'm going to apply to work with sensitive communities, so elderly, with children, that will still appear on background checks for working with sensitive populations. It also doesn't change my ability to obtain a firearm. The prohibitions on firearm with conviction still remain intact. So the process, as I said, so DOJ manages the process. And then another important piece of this is that the Department of Justice then pushes the lists of people that got relief down to the county courts. So people may know there's the state live scan, which is one way people can get a background check. But oftentimes you're not doing that, right? You're using the commercial background check companies, whatever the different private background check companies, that's what landlords, et cetera, are often using. And so the onus is on local courts to then update their records, since that's often where these private background check companies are getting their records. And then another level is the onus on the background check companies to make sure they're accurately reporting records.
So I'm going to circle back to this point because I think it's important. But first, I need to ask the next question, which always comes up when we talk about clean slate stuff. And that is to try to explain to the general public that don't live and die with this stuff, just how impactful these convictions are for normal processes of life.
People think just felony convictions, but even misdemeanor arrests from all levels can have huge impacts. And it can be whether it's accessing housing, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, if I am convicted, if I have a conviction on the record that affects my partner, to get certain housing subsidies, to get housing with landlords. There's this move towards ban the box, where employers aren't checking the whether someone has a criminal record at the outset, but it still comes up at the end of the interview process. It also can affect kind of ability to engage in family life, whether that's going to chaperone your child's field trip. There's all these aspects of life that just make it so difficult to really re-engage in your community, in your family, and what we want to give people so that they can kind of thrive. And if we think about this from a public safety example, or motivation rather, which I don't think is the main reason, but you think you want to set people up for success once they're released, done with their sentence. And this is part of the move to kind of help people do that.
Yeah. So, one of my favorite stories actually is a personal story. So when my wife and I went to adopt our daughter 15 years ago, she had been a labor organizer, and she had gone to Texas like 20 years ago to, unionize the janitors, and they all got arrested and they ended up pleading to a misdemeanor. So that was on her record. So in order for us to be eligible to adopt, we had to apply to the Department of Justice for a waiver. If you think about this, right? Protest, trespass violation is probably the most innocuous conviction that you can have on your record. And yet we had to go through these extra little hoops. Fortunately, easily done. But you can imagine you have a misdemeanor on your record from even 20 years ago that hasn't disappeared. That can be really impactful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so we've talked with folks that work drug policy. And so people that have drug convictions on their record, even if they're misdemeanors, are often not eligible to rent apartments. They're not eligible to stay in an apartment. Like if you were staying with your mother and she was in Section 8 housing, she wouldn't be eligible to let you live there. Which, if you think about it, is really absurd, right? Do we really want people with criminal records to not have access to housing and jobs? I mean, I would think the opposite would be true.
Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I mean, it's interesting too when you talk about there's the misdemeanor, the drug possession is a huge story, and I think in California, what we saw, one of the things I knew, but was also interesting. The most common record that's being relieved is a misdemeanor DUI. And so you just kind of think about, and I think that that's a helpful thing for listeners when you think about, okay, what is the scope of records that are being relieved? You know, that's the most common. And just mostly it is kind of misdemeanor offenses that are being relieved through these.
And this isn't get out of jail free, because let's say I have a DUI from 10 years ago, it gets relieved, and then I do another DUI tomorrow. You know, the court's going to know about that. Like, it doesn't appear.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things too is you can technically move in and out of clean slate status if you think about it in a way where you could have something and there's enough of a waiting period. But what we did is we looked and we said, okay, how many people do we think are going to receive clean slate, and project how many do we think are going to have a new offense within 5 years? And majority were not. Majority of people, I think it was over 70%, were not going to have any new arrest or conviction. And I think importantly, very few, I think we estimated about 2% of people would get a new offense that would never be eligible for any automatic relief. So these are people, you know, it just kind of motivates that point. That's, you know, these are people that had a record or a set of records, and it's been a period. They had to wait the waiting periods. And then when we look at their trajectories going forward, very unlikely to pick up a new record.
And that fits in kind of the overall pattern of offending, because, you know, usually what happens, and there are exceptions, of course, and they're not going to be eligible anyway. But usually what happens is somebody does something dumb when they're young. Sometimes it's more serious than just doing something dumb. But, you know, a lot of people, you know, they're dumb when they're young. I was dumb when I was young. I was lucky I didn't get convicted of anything, but, you know, I was definitely guilty of doing stupid things. And I think it's really important that, you know, most people, they do something dumb, you know, maybe they drank in public, or, you know, they got small offense, or maybe, you know, they were dumb and drove while after having 3 drinks and didn't realize that they were gonna, you know, get pulled over and blow over 0.08. There's a whole host of things that shouldn't be impacting the future ability to get jobs, have housing, get educational loans, which is another thing that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Like, if you have drug convictions, you can't get educational loans. Okay, don't we kind of want people to be educated? Like, isn't that a pathway out of crime? So why are we punishing them? I can go on all day.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you know, it's the classic, you know, let's not define people by what may have been the worst day, biggest mistake of their life, maybe, you know. And so just this wanting to give, and it's often called the second chance movement, but I personally don't think we should restrict to just a second chance, but just this idea that these are members of our community, these are members of our family, and wanting to kind of give them support and opportunities to thrive and contribute. And a criminal record can really impinge on their ability to do that.
So when you guys did this report, what did you find most surprising?
You know, I think that just the sheer number, even though we, you know, the numbers, we specifically looked at 2.8 million Californians with a conviction between 2010 and 2022. And we think, you know, 90% of those people would get at least one record relieved. And for most people, about 70%, everything would be relieved. That's millions of Californians. And so if you think about kind of that in terms of, you know, sheer number of people, I think that, you know, just seeing that number is so incredible and potentially impactful. I think really seeing too the estimates of how many people would maintain their clean slate status. So seeing that most people would not pick up a new record after they get this relief. And this is us just looking at it before, without people having any awareness that their record was relieved. So you could think that if there was notification, if people were aware, that number would potentially even be higher. And so I think just that, those kind of two pieces, just the sheer number, and then for the amount of people that maintain that clean slate.
And that speaks to the sheer magnitude of the carceral system. 2.5 million, that's just in California. That's just over an 11-year period.
Yep.
I mean,
And
that's incredible.
And that's just convictions. So we focused mostly on conviction relief because we think that will really have the greatest impact for people. But obviously there are people with arrest records as well. So this is just, one slice of that.
And another piece of this that we haven't really delved into is the racial component. So one of the things that the report noted was Black Californians are overrepresented among those eligible for automatic record relief. So, they're like 13% of the convictions, but 24% of those eligible. So, they're overrepresented in the convictions, and then they're almost double overrepresented in eligibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think anyone who does anything remotely that touches the criminal justice system, knows that disparities are at every point in the system, racial and ethnic disparities. And when we look at this, the automatic record relief, or rather the higher share that are only eligible for relief through a petition, our report doesn't get into the reasons for that. There's obviously lots of research that talks about this, differences in policing, access to representation, differences how Black people are charged, convicted compared to their white counterparts, et cetera. And I would kind of encourage folks that want to kind of really dig into this and learn more is that there's a really great National Academies of Sciences report that was released a few years ago that really digs into the historic roots of inequalities in the criminal justice system, talks about the inequalities today, and identifies some evidence-driven policy and research recommendations. And I think, when we look at this, I personally, I think that we should be having a mind for when we design these policies to make sure they're impacting people that were most impacted by mass incarceration. So making sure that people that were most impacted by mass incarceration are benefiting from these policies. And I do think, it's amazing that 200,000 Black Californians, we estimate, got a clean slate. But again, not forgetting that there are those disparities that remain.
Do you see any downside to this law?
So I think we often on our team, we like to call it as a necessary but not sufficient piece of legislation. I think that this is really important legislation to pass. It's the right thing to do. There's a concern or question about how aware people are without notification. And so if you think about that, how would we expect a person's behavior to change, whether that's, maybe they wanted to move apartments and are, don't want to go through it because they don't want to get a background check. They have no idea that their record was relieved. And so they're not going to change their behavior as a result of that. And I think we kind of go through this in some of our recommendations, but whether it's a kind of free and secure way for people to be able to look up their own record status. We have an advisory board of folks, and we partner with qualitative researchers. So we have an advisory board of folks with lived experience with the criminal legal system. We partner with a qualitative researcher, and just kind of some of the trends coming out of those conversations are just general, lack of awareness about this policy, which makes total sense. There's so much happening in the world. And so I think that that's one of the big things in terms of just making sure that people are aware that their status has changed, or being able to kind of easily and freely check their record status. And then I think one of the other challenges with this is what we kind of talked about earlier, is this, it's very clear what's happening at the state level, and less so of when you trickle down to the counties. So we've heard anecdotally that some counties are actually taking their own kind of process to clear eligible records. So that could be more expansive than what's happening at the state. So there's instances where your record could look different at the local versus state level. And, we don't quite know whether all counties have the capacity to kind of update those records that DOJ clears. So maybe there's a lag, maybe they're not updated at all. And then that has a really big impact on private background check companies. So then even if all 58 counties are keeping their records updated perfectly, then there's the question of, how reliably are private background check companies updating their records? The onus is on the person if the record is incorrect, which is a lot to put on a single person. So I think that there's just this, it's when we talk about kind of very necessary but not sufficient. But when you think about kind of at the very top, you have your record that could look this way, but then as you kind of go down and kind of other ways that people check your record, it could appear very differently than what it does at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good points there. I mean, I would think like just a simple postcard notification would be, one thing that could be done, because it seems like people should be aware that their record has changed so they don't have to disclose things that they didn't need to disclose. And you also remind me of a very interesting story that happened 2 years ago where I live. There was a woman running for city council. She was running for re-election, and somehow her opponents had found out that 25 years ago, she was involved in kind of this strange case that she got a conviction on, it got expunged, but for some reason, the court failed to remove it from the public display. And so they were able to pull it up, and they tried to use it against her. It kind of backfired on them because it was so petty. But, you could see like, if people are not aware that their records are being expunged, they can't check to make sure everybody's done what they're supposed to do, and they're not even aware that they need to check. I mean, that does seem pretty problematic to me.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And I would imagine your council member had the resources and ability to kind of make sure that was
Yeah,
the record straight.
fixed, but
Yeah.
it caused her a big headache that she didn't need to
Course.
have.
Yeah, but you think about just kind of the average person that's applying for a job, a new apartment, and a record shows up on some private company that shouldn't be there. They have the right to kind of challenge that and get redress, but at the individual level, that seems very challenging, especially when that's not the only thing most people have going on in their lives.
Especially if you don't know to look.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you got like a postcard that said, "Hey, congratulations, your record has been expunged."
Yeah.
And then you can go to these places to make sure it's actually been done. That would seem to be, and it probably wouldn't cost a lot. I mean, you could have an automated process to do that. So that would make sense. I mean, because I know, having been in this business for a long time, that stuff shows up in records that you would never expect. I mean, police are often pulling up false arrests and other things on people's records that actually shouldn't be there. Nobody knows to actually look there and be able to clear that out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's, and then there's layers of the private background check companies that are regulated, then those that are not regulated. So it is kind of, there are layers to this. And so when we talk about necessary but not sufficient, I feel like that's one of the examples.
Yeah. So, but mostly this is good, right? I mean, this is a way to allow people that have kept themselves clean to then go about their lives and not have a life sentence just because they made a mistake when they were 18.
Absolutely.
All right. Any other thoughts?
No, I think we covered most of the key things that I had wanted to make sure we talked about. Yeah, just to note, we are planning to do kind of future research around this that's looking at first and foremost, kind of recidivism impacts. So does either the receipt of a clean slate or kind of the promise, does that have any impact on kind of how what we see? We always want to look at public safety impacts, and recidivism is always the kind of closest proxy we have to that. So that's some of the work that we're looking at now.
Now, I know that there's been other studies that have looked at, recidivism rates among people whose records have been expunged. And my memory off the top of my head is that the rates are extremely low, and in fact, lower than the crime rate.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I'm not as familiar with all of the studies, but yes, I think that's right. I think one of the challenges and one of the things that we're trying to get at is, particularly when you think about the expungement, one of the challenges with that research is who the comparison group is, right? So a person that's going to go and take the time to fill out the paperwork, to get the petition, that's a very different person than kind of just the average person with a criminal record or et cetera. And so wanting to say, are there factors, is there something with the people that actually took the time to get expunged that are correlated with their other outcomes, correlated with lower likelihood of recidivating, for lack of better words. And so wanting to use kind of the implementation of this law to kind of be able to compare people to similarly situated people and be able to isolate kind of that impact or of automatic relief, if there is
Yeah.
one.
And I'll go out on a limb and guess that the people that actually take the time to actually go through the process are much less likely to commit new crimes than people that are automatically alleviated. But still, if somebody's clean for 10 years, most of the time they're going to stay clean for the next 10 years.
Yep. Absolutely.
So I feel like that's an important point that the average person should understand, is that once you get yourself out of stuff, usually you don't get back in as you get older. When you get older, you get more boring, not more more crazy. I mean, there are always exceptions, but that's why but again, I think it's important to note that, let's say I go out and commit a crime, 10 years after I committed one that got alleviated, that doesn't disappear from the court's assessment of my case. It
absolutely.
just means that I'm not going to be precluded from getting a job. And there are some jobs that, they can look past that anyway, like if it's really sensitive. So if I were going to be, get a license to be a daycare teacher, stuff is never going to go away in terms of what they're looking at.
Yeah. Those are important points to make, I think. Absolutely. Yeah. That there is the record remains to law enforcement, to the courts. Again, it must be disclosed in sensitive contexts. And like you said, it doesn't preclude someone from getting a record in the future.
All right. Well, thank you, Alissa, for coming on. I feel like this is actually a good thing, a necessary thing. It's not going to impact people's safety, but it is going to allow people to move on with their lives, get jobs, get education, get places to live. And actually, I take that back. That will affect our safety, because those people are going to be much less likely to have to commit crimes in the future.
Yes. Appreciate the conversation.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.